Thanks, Anthony, and thanks to the Philosopher for hosting this event. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with Brad Evans today. So Brad, the first thing I wanted to raise, maybe as a way of framing the discussion, because I think it is a fundamental issue when thinking about violence, is the relationship of violence to history. And I think this is important because when one encounters discussions of violence, I think both in philosophy, but also in public discussions, there is a tendency to come across one of two positions. And I think the first is a tendency to naturalize violence and to make it into something which is constant throughout history. And that will often be grounded in an argument that violence is somehow inherent to human nature. So humans are by nature predisposed to commit violence. And obviously someone like Hobbes would be a key reference point here. And the other position, I think, is maybe one that admits that there is a kind of historical variance to violence, but that would be indexed to or interpreted within the framework of an idea of progress. So here you might think about someone like Steven Pinker, who claims that progress is the greatest fact of human history. And so we'll think that, violence over time has decreased, and that is a sign of human progress. So I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are and how we can maybe engage in a different way with this question about the relation of violence and history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think obviously, first, thanks for inviting me to this event, and it's a pleasure to engage in conversation with you as well. And I think there's so much to really unpack with what you just said there. I think just going through start points. I think the first point you make actually is really important about engaging in a discussion, right? And I think actually we too often forget that, especially when we deal with philosophies of violence, that we can kind of somehow retreat into some kind of conceptual universe, and actually, if violence demands anything, it demands a conversation. And it demands a conversation across multiple disciplines. And the one thing I've learned, and I try to do constantly in my work, is try to say that no academic discipline has a monopoly on violence, right? So, and when it comes to interrogating and engaging in violence, it demands the broadest conversation we can imagine, and equally to recognize that there are so many different actors and agents, all of whom have an equally important political voice to make in terms of interrogating and breaking down violence. So I think that's kind of almost like a pedagogical start point for me. Now, you're absolutely right in terms of the historical. And I think one thing we should learn, is that all violence has a history, right? Violence doesn't simply, fall from the skies. Sometimes it does literally in terms of bombs, but all violence has a history. Violence is a process. Violence, and if we look at the analysis of violence, actually, what we find actually is that very little violence is actually random. No, very, in terms of the broad sweep of history and, the widespread engagement of violence, most violence is reasoned, rationalized, and calculated. Most violence is planned. Most violence is articulated through different claims. Now, the question which I've kind of been proper, you kind of, you talk about that move, for instance, from Hobbes through to Steven Pinker, it's like out of bookend history, right? With, Hobbes to Pinker. But I think it's important. But I think if we start perhaps first with Pinker, because I think this is, I'm kind of quite Foucauldian in this way, and kind of saying, well, we're always trying to conduct a history of the present. I think first of all, there's so much wrong with Pinker's work, right? How do we even begin from his conceptualization of violence, from the way in which violence is just measured quantifiably? And I think there's so much that's ethically kind of remiss with so much of what he does. But the inability to simply recognize the ways in which progress is an absolute fundamental aspect of modern histories of violence. If we want to look at the way in which violence has been rationalized, justified, calculated since the turn of the 17th century, then we have to make sense of the ways in which it's aligned to narratives of progress, and the ways in which, ideas of a better life can really justify, violence. And I think this is an important point that if we then bring it back in terms of what we might talk about a public conversation on violence. To me, what marks out something as political violence is precisely the need for justification. we have to connect, it has to be justified, right? It has to be connected to a message. It has to communicate a certain value and a certain attribute. Now, this to me then allows us to kind of recognize, first of all, okay, what is the ways in which violence does get justified? And how does that articulate itself in terms of the, the realm of the public? And then we can kind of tease out something of a more of a historical continuity to this. And maybe we can go on to that in a bit, but I think there is something certainly there in the narratives of violence, which have to be justified. And often that's done through narratives of progress.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that you raised that, especially if we think about some of the justifications that have been given for dominant major acts of state violence in recent years. So if you think, for example, about the justification for the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, or if you think about various so-called humanitarian interventions, they will always lock progress in terms of their justification to this idea of creating a better world or a more safe world, or defending, the security of a population. And then you can contrast that with the polarization, which you find in, the characterizations of terrorism or violence in, let's say, non-Western parts of the world, which are often seen as regressive or anti-civilizational in some sense.
Well, I think it's really important for us to kind of say, first of all, I think all forms of violence demand very particular critiques, right? So in that sense, there's an evident danger that when we do kind of historical comparisons sometimes, that we can flatten violence or kind of say that it's all logically the same, because it isn't, right? That, violence today is very different to violence in the mid part of the 20th century. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't tease out certain common logics, which kind of traverse across time. And one of the things which I've been working on in a book which is coming out actually next month with Columbia University Press, it's called Ecce Humanitas, Beholding the Pain of Humanity. And the thing which I'm kind of really fascinated with is the ways in which, if we look at the broad sweep of history, you talk about, for instance, the idea of just war, which takes place during the War on Terror. That, to me, if we look at the broad sweep of history, what marks out the particular metaphysical claim of violence, historically and contemporaneously, is the ways in which, even as it goes through various iterations from pre-modern to the modern period, in terms of the late modern capitalism we encounter today, is that violence needs to make a naked appeal to a certain metaphysics. And by that, I mean all violence has to appeal to a certain idea of faith. In other words, the broad sweep of history is a broad sweep of religious war. Now, René Girard understood this all too well, but he wanted to advance the idea of the sacred. For me, what I'm trying to do is actually break down the sacred. And if you look, for instance, in terms of the wars on terror as an obvious example, they were religious wars, right? Tony Blair, when he says, all I have is my faith in humanity, that's a theological statement. It's not a political statement. Right? And I think just war itself, anybody knows the history of just war, knows it goes all the way back to St. Augustine. It's a religious doctrine. But I think all forms of great violence connect to a notion of the sacred, to the sacrificial. And this is where we can find some kind of commonality across history, where then, even though we have progressive narratives, I guess I'm quite Schmittian in this way, when where all modern concepts are basically secularized theological concepts. We have to justify the sacrifice. It has to be worthy of something. To sacrifice something means it's there for the greater good. And violence can often be justified because it's for the greater good. What is that greater good? Well, it's always based on faith. Why do we bomb Iraq? Because we believe the future will be better. That's not based on empirical fact. That's a position of faith. And I think that's where we can start really breaking apart violence, is to ask, what progressive narratives does it talk to? But how does that reveal a certain theology as well by people who profess to be completely secular? And I think that's where some really interesting conversations can take place.
So what do you think, in terms of this kind of secularization of violence, or an apparent secularization of violence, which still has a theological undergirding, what do you think that means in terms of the visibility and invisibility of violence. Do you think it creates a specific mode of appearing or of not appearing of violence? I mean, I was thinking as you were just making your point about, certain language, a certain very technologized language about violence and about the justification of violence, where often we find violence justified because it is somehow made so technologically efficient that there is nothing excessive about it. So you can think about this idea of surgical warfare, ultra precise targeting, or the discourse of so-called non-lethal weaponry, which probably should be more accurately called semi-lethal weaponry, because people are still killed by rubber-coated bullets. But do you think this strange condition of an apparently secularized violence, which has this kind of rationalized justification in technological terms, but nonetheless has a theological grounding, do you think that produces a kind of problematic status of violence in terms of how visible or invisible it is?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. Well, I think, first of all, if we talk about violence, the first thing about political violence is it demands an audience in one way or another, right? So there has to be some kind of audience. But we know, of course, that all forms of political violence are also deeply mediated. So what you see, what you don't see, goes through a great deal of mediation. And we can learn a great deal about violence, actually, by asking who is the intended audience for the witnessing of violence. And of course, not all witnessing is universal, right? So, so there's always a mediation taking place between the appearance and the non-appearance of violence, the visibility, the realm of the visible and the realm of the invisible. Now, certainly I agree with you in terms of, if we think then about the advent of modernity, of course, what the advent of modernity in many ways represents is the triumph of technology. But the certain triumph of a technological kind of orientation through which, nobody worked through this better, I don't think, than Zygmunt Bauman in his book Modernity and the Holocaust, where, what the advent of modernity does is makes violence more efficient, more effective, more reasonable, more calculated, more, so we can create production lines of slaughter. And what Bauman, of course, really stresses is the ways in which the more you can distance a person from the physical act of killing, the greater the capacity for a genocide, right? So, if you make it kind of aligned with industrial production, if you make it hyper-technologized. But I do think that there is something very different also taking place in the world today, because if we talk, for instance, about, first of all, this shift towards the appearance of violence, we live in an age, Guy Debord was right, the spectacle has become the defining organizational principles for modern societies. And this was something I wrote in a book with Henry Giroux called Disposable Futures, where we really run with Debord's theory and try to kind of say, well, there's the spectacle has now become defining. But also what I think we've also realized is the way in which, I kind of agree with Francois Laurel here when he says that what we've also encountered is a kind of overdetermination of the victim. And the victim has become subjected to such overt politicization, notably through the wars on terror, the ways in which, the body of the woman and the child will be appropriated to justify wars and violence. The victim has now become so overdetermined, it doesn't actually, mobilize us anymore. Now, this to me is not just, a problem in terms of the representation of the victim. It actually, to me, reveals the failure of liberalism. And actually, that liberalism itself has actually collapsed. And again, one of the things which I'm writing about in the this forthcoming book, Ecce Humanitas, is that liberalism is dead. The liberal claim of the victim is dead. And this has been replaced by a new order. And that new order is what I've called the new global techno-theodicy. And this techno-theodicy is a world which is now dominated by technology, which can justify violence in precisely the surgical, invisible ways that you kind of mentioned. And that to me is where we're entering into a new paradigm for violence and warfare in particular. And I think one of the interesting things about war today, if you think about it, is that we're in an age today where nobody even declares war anymore. Wars are no longer declared. That, as the war on terror even ended, nobody has any idea. Right? We think it's kind of ended, but we have no idea whether it's ended or not. And we can now engage in surgical strikes in Pakistan or whatever we want across the planet without war ever being declared. it's become so normalized. And I think that is only possible by the shift in terms of the paradigm of technology and violence that this makes possible, which also appeals to a certain sacred order of politics as well.
Mm. I certainly agree that there does seem to be a tendency towards a kind of dispersion and perpetuity of conflicts around the world. I'm wondering about, I mean, I think again, this comes back to this issue of how to think, violence in its historical specificity, but I'm wondering about how, what you describe as a new order might affect the threshold between tolerable and intolerable violence, which obviously is a kind of fundamental aspect of any political order. Do you think that this new techno-theodicy is introducing some new dynamic in how the relation between what we see as a tolerable and even normalized form of violence and what is understood to be intolerable and contested? And, you can think of recent examples like the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, which is a contestation of a certain kind of state violence. Do you think there is a kind of shift in the way that those boundaries are being determined?
Yes, and it's kind of interesting, again, if we put this in a historical context, it's quite remarkable when you think about it that this September is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I've not yet any mention, no conversation, no public, to me, this would have been inconceivable 10 years ago, that we've almost kind of forgotten 9/11. However momentous and intolerable as an event 9/11 was, the scarring that it caused on global politics, it's almost been forgotten, right? So we're kind of, 2 decades on, and you kind of think, well, this is quite, I could never have imagined that when 9/11 was happening, that only 2 decades on, it would simply not have the resonance. When at the point when nobody's actually talking about it today. Now, what we can think about in terms of 9/11 as, as a spectacle, we could say, well, perhaps, in terms of the age of global instantaneous communication, it was kind of unrivaled as an intolerable act of violence. But it seems like the organizations who are responding to this new world order have kind of recognized that you can't kind of compete with that level of spectacles. You look, for instance, at groups such as ISIS, who have developed now their own modalities of intolerable violence. And the intolerable violence that they do is not the violence of a grand epic scale like 9/11. It's violence of a much more intimate nature. Violence, actually, which is much more savvy to the technological order of things. Violence in which the videos can go viral. So there is a much more kind of broader kind of understanding then of this kind of violence of, the everyday, in which certain subjectivities are put on trial. And this is what I find particularly disturbing about this kind of violence. It's almost like a certain blowback within the system, where you have this constant and naked appeal to the intolerable in terms of the hyper subjectivization of the violence. And I think this is the one thing, for instance, which groups like ISIS do in terms of, we think about sacred violence and sacrificial violence, the way in which ISIS constantly play to the sacrificial motif. They are constantly sacrificing victims. And the victims which they are constantly killing as a spectacle, right, have very clear kind of lines in terms of who they're going to kill, and certain subjectivities who are going to be put on trial: the journalist, the aid worker, the homosexual. This is kind of hyper subjectivized violence, which is fully in keeping with the hyper aroused sensibilities of the new media age. And I think that there's something in which the logics of sacred violence then mimic the technologies of the time.
Yeah, and there are certainly strong parallels, I think, between some of the techniques that groups like ISIS have adopted and things that you see in a place like Mexico, where you have, again, the use of a kind of ultra excessive, very spectacular forms of violence linked to specific logics of power. So, for example, many of the cartels in Mexico, they wear uniforms and they have trucks which are branded with their own logos, and they often resemble, the government logo. They're of a similar style to a government logo. So in one sense, they reference the kind of logics and aesthetics of power that you see from the state, but then they have also generated their own kind of grammar, visual grammar of violence. So there are very specific public displays of violence. So it could be things like bodies hanging from bridges or heads displayed alongside a road. And these aren't just things which are mediatized, in the sense of circulated in the media, but they're also things which people see on the streets, and it's become a commonplace part of life for many people in parts of Mexico. So there is a kind of, it is interesting to reflect on this self-consciousness that the perpetrators of violence have about the modes of aestheticization or the modes of spectacle which they use in committing the violence. And it makes it very hard in the end to separate acts of violence from the representations of the violence. They somehow seem to blend into one another.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this goes back to this earlier point, though, in terms of violence doesn't come easy to humans, right? Your opening, comment, and I didn't actually comment on the time about this idea that, that violence is natural to the human species. I don't believe this at all. I don't think that humans are naturally violent, because if that was the case, I think we would be long extinct, right? We are, of course, we can be violent, but I don't think humans come easy to violence. There's a reason why most of us don't walk down the street and just engage in random acts of rage upon one another. Okay, that's reserved for Twitter, right? People are raging constantly, but while they're waiting for their decaffeinated coffees. I don't think that, violence, physical violence, comes very easy to people. And in that sense, violence takes a great deal of organization. It takes a great deal of planning. It's a learning process. You have to learn to be a killer. You have to, David Grossman understood this when he was writing about On Killing. Why do these, soldiers suffer from PTSD when they come back from war zones? Well, they can't switch it off once you press the switch, right? So violence in itself then is a learning process. And these organizations, they know this, right? And you think, and then in terms of, the ways in which, I really like the phrase you use this visual grammars of violence. That too is a learning process. It's, it's what Zygmunt Bauman says, the Holocaust was an experiment, right? It didn't start off the way it did. It is also a learning process. You see what works, you see what terrifies, you see what has the most effect. In Mexico, you have this, endemic state of disappearance, but disappearance is not enough. Every now and again, you need a body to show, right? You need a body to turn up. The 43 students, one of them was left, right? So to serve as the warning, so you have to have that kind of interplay between disappearance and appearance, between the absence and the presence of violence. And I think that learning process, the cartel, is it the Los Zetas, the traces they have with the School of the Americas, right? And, there's a history of this learning process of organizations, which, again, there's a great deal of planning organization that goes in to commit the most abhorrent acts of violence. This is as true for the cartels as it's true for ISIS, as it's true for nation states. There is a certain professionalization, especially in the aestheticization of violence.
Yeah, and I think that also points to another important way in which it's very difficult and we lose something very important if we reduce violence simply to the acts in which it is committed, because violence also creates, one of the effects of violence is to create a particular lived atmosphere or a lived environment. So living in an environment in which you're aware of the threat of certain forms of violence, of course, shapes people's actions. It shapes the way that people relate to one another and the things that they do and what they believe is possible or not possible. So you see that very much in Mexico, the way that an atmosphere of fear has been created by these images. So part of the function of this violence is to lead people to believe that they're under a state of constant threat, and therefore to not resist, to not organize, to not do certain kinds of things. I think the discourse of kind of surgical warfare and drone warfare or highly technologized crowd control also performs a similar function. It's there to make people believe that if they do anything, if they transgress at all, then they will be found and targeted and violence will be committed against them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there is something very clear also at work here when we think about violence as an ecology, right? So we can talk about then, there's clearly an ecology of violence at work. And again, I would point again to, there's a brilliant short book by Peter Sloterdijk called Terror from the Air. And he talks about, there's this, this pivotal moment in World War I in Ypres in France, which is the first time the toxic gas is used as a nerve agent. And it's the first time that basically military strategists realized that the atmosphere can be weaponized. And it's from this very moment that the term climate of fear first originates, right? So, when we think about like radical environmental politics, the military are a century ahead of us, right, in terms of recognizing the active manipulation of the environment to bring about devastation, pain, suffering, terror. So violence, of course, has an ecology. And if we can talk of a natural history of violence, then it has to be associated with that critical understanding of ecologies of terror and the ecologies of fear that can produce. So in that sense, you're absolutely right. And this is where some of Steven Pinker's ideas break apart, that violence is not just simply a bodily act, right? Or sometimes that's often the intermezzo point where prior to that violence, there's a great deal of terror. After the physical act of violence, there's a great deal of terror. And I think, to understand then those ecologies of violence and the way in which violence itself literally lives and breathes, I think is something we also need to be very mindful of. Having said this, there is also a danger that we don't kind of go the opposite direction and say, well, psychological violence is far greater than actual physical violence. I see this happening too much on the left today, where people are saying, well, somebody is now subjected to a small microaggression, and that's far worse than people living an endemic life of actual physical violence. I think we need to kind of to temper that enthusiasm for that as well, because that is equally to me as pernicious in terms of an analysis as much as Pinker's analysis, which seems to forget that psychology really impacts on violence, which is strange coming from him, really. So.
Yeah, and I suppose we can think about that as another strategy of power. For example, the state can designate these contestations of violence as something which plays out in the private realm, as something which occurs in language, in discourse. So people will, be engaged in a culture war over which forms of language can be used and which kinds of microaggressions are, seriously devastating to people's life. Or the state at the same time has a complete monopoly over, the use of violence, a highly militarized police force, et cetera, a vast, complex carceral system, et cetera. So configuring, what are deemed certain forms of contestable violence and those which are completely beyond the realm of contestation, I think is another way we can think about violence being used as a strategy of power.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is central to contemporary strategies of power. No? We can think about, the whole debates in politics today is about contesting whose violence is permissible. So I think there is something in that then where you can kind of say, well, whose version of history are we talking about? Whose violence are we talking about? And ultimately, there's a great deal of competition taking place, which some of it I find quite, difficult to really work through, about who has suffered the most historically, or who is the greatest victim of history. Of course, it's important to really open up these conversations, but not in a way where suffering becomes a competition. And I think that's also something which we see too often, actually, particularly on social media debates concerning this. So as if, being a victim is a stake in a competition. And I think that takes us too far in the other direction, I think.
I mean, I think the one thing that has been important, that has been raised by, certain decolonial interventions of different forms is to really think about, and this comes back to this question of progress, but to think about the ways in which violence is registered and how that is distributed culturally, geographically, ethnically, and very much embedded in certain relationships of power that have a colonial history. I mean, you can think about Amos Césaire's declaration that what made the Holocaust so horrific to people was not actually what went on in the Holocaust, but it was that was done to European people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree, and I also think and it also resonates through the work of Hannah Arendt as well. When she said, the biggest crime that Hitler did was to turn Europe into a colony, right? And I think that there is something in that which has to be remembered and has to be, we have to attend, as you say, to the lived experience of coloniality and the continued lived structures of deeply embedded structures of racism and so forth, but also not in a way which also kind of, forgets that there's a lot of very poor white communities who also deeply suffer from the same structures of violence as well. I grew up in South Wales, which it's a very poor part of the UK, and people there really, for over 100 years have suffered, constant systems of structural violence, so I think it's a kind of, and it has a great deal of history with, people like Paul Robeson used to go to the South Wales valleys and find solidarities with those people. And I think that's perhaps one of the biggest challenges we encounter today in politics, is how do we kind of bridge those kind of identity divides in a way where, as I say, we can speak and recognize both histories of injustice. I think is an important thing for us to all consider, maybe.
I wanted to just ask you about, we've spoken about the way in which violence is aestheticized, particularly by perpetrators and through certain, mediatized structures, and also about the way in which violence constitutes a kind of lived environment or a lived atmosphere. I'm just wondering what you think, because I know you have worked on this, what you think about the possibility of also resisting or contesting violence from those same domains or from those same standpoints. So, for example, whether there might be certain aesthetic strategies of resistance or contestation that might be effective in trying to resist violence, or there might be ways of engaging with those lived environments in which threat is a perpetual presence that could constitute effective strategies of resistance.
Mm-hmm. On a very basic level, maybe I'm a bit of an idealist, but I still believe in the importance of non-violence as a political strategy. And I think non-violence as a political strategy has been shown to work very well historically. And so in that, to me, I think I certainly believe in the importance of non-violence. But I think more broader, to me, there's two real important questions here. The first, when you talk about the aestheticization of politics, I think we need to have a better appreciation of the difference between art and aesthetics. Now, for me, I'm a strong believer in the idea, first of all, that politics is an art and not a science. And if we understand the political to be something which is associated with something we might call the imagination, we know that there is a history of the human condition which presents the history and the lived experience of the human condition as being one of this natural history of violence. I think we need to break out of that narrative, because I don't think that is the only story that's available to us. Now, for me, in order for us to do that, we need to construct better myths, better fables, better narratives. In other words, appeal more to the poetic. And I think that, for me, if I say to my students, if you want to understand the violence of law, okay, read Hobbes, but read Kafka, right? We need to engage with the literary imagination. We need to, I think one of the best books ever written is Alice in Wonderland. It's full of arbitrary violence, right? So if we want to understand, for me, to open up a fundamental critique of violence, we need to understand better the strategies of the poetic. What does a poetic sensibility look like? And in that sense, I think at the forefront of any strategy of resistance, we need to recognize, far more importantly, the role the arts and humanities play, especially art in terms of constructing an antechamber to the world. We need to develop new appreciation for the aesthetic imagination in which artists and creative producers have an equally important role in terms of, galvanizing a new political imagination, which is counter to the politics of the sacred. And I think that's where perhaps, for me, it seems strange to say this in this time. And when I talk about art, I don't mean the art world, what appears in, the Gagosian gallery or something. I'm talking about, forms of artistic intervention. If you want to understand violence, just go and sit for the afternoon in a room full of Rothkos. Right? You will learn more about the abyss and violence than any textbook on violence. So I think there is something deeply important about art, especially today in a time where the arts seem to be so much under attack. And that, for me, there's for good reason that as well. So.
Well, there's much more we could talk about, but I think we should move on to the questions now, because there's quite a few questions that have come in from the audience. So I'll begin with some that have already been submitted. So there's one from an anonymous attendee. You mentioned earlier that Steven Pinker's conception of violence is inadequate. Please, can you say why this is so, and whether you think we have any more effective ways than Pinker's of measuring rates of violence over time?
My biggest problem with Pinker is the crude measures of quantification that he uses, and the ways in which, when we start amassing all forms of data analysis like he invariably does, I don't want to kind of, say that he hasn't done a great deal of work in this book, because, The Better Angels of Our Nature is a formidable book. There's a reason why so many people talk about it. But it tells a good story, right? It tells a great story that we are becoming less and less violent. First of all, as many critics have pointed out, most of his assumptions based on anything pre-modern is based on wild speculation, because we simply don't know how violent or not those societies ever were anyway. But he's based his analysis on wild speculation. There's a certain kind of hidden racism which kind of creeps through in terms of the way in which he understands so-called savage societies. But also, my biggest problem is precisely this kind of quantified approach to violence, in which we can statistically measure violence across the ages without understanding the broad lived effects of violence, which cannot simply be put into statistics. I'm not saying that we shouldn't get away from the fact that body counts are important. Of course they are. But what I do think is that his analysis on violence lends itself overwhelmingly to this quantified approach in a way which kind of doesn't deal with, the violence of everyday incarceration, which simply doesn't feature in his statistics. So how do we understand the structural forms of violence that he doesn't account for? The violence of homelessness, the violence of poverty, which don't measure in his statistics really in any detailed way. So that to me is where I have big problems. But also it's more about, the way that we can simply apply a quantitative method to violence, which I find very problematic.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think there are, serious philosophical issues with this idea that you could measure violence in the way that you can measure the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, for example. Mm-hmm. But even saying that, there are some interesting figures who have contested on an empirical basis, I think, some of Pinker's work. So, for example, Michael Mann, sociologist, has done some very interesting work in which he's also worked with the figures themselves and suggested that, in fact, there's no reason to think that the 20th century was any less violent. In fact, it might have been more violent than many previous epochs. The question really would just be something like, well, what are the forms that this violence takes? Mm-hmm. Another very interesting researcher, there's an archaeologist called Roderick Campbell, who has actually done a lot of work on pre-modern or so-called prehistorical societies, using the archaeological evidence to then try to develop certain theorizations of how violence might have operated in those societies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I agree. And also, there's a lot of, really interesting, sometimes comical studies done on the so-called dark ages in the UK, where, where actually it wasn't that dark. We have these tacit assumptions about the history of these societies where we see them as brutal and violent, where actually, the analysis tells us the different. And as you say, the idea that the 20th century is, not so violent is absurd to anybody. Just read Eric Hobsbawm, right?
Yeah. So we have another question from Amanda McBride. I've really enjoyed the focus on political organized state violence. I was wondering if you could say something about interpersonal violence. I'm thinking about people whacking their kids, the violence that occurs in the context of intimate relationships, fisticuffs outside the bar at closing time. Brad mentioned violence isn't necessarily natural, which is fair enough, but it seems pretty bloody widespread and not at all so obviously linked to power structures already considered. Any thoughts on that would be great.
So, 2 points. First of all, it's pretty widespread depending on where you happen to reside, right? If I go out into the local area in Bristol where I live this evening, if there was not a lockdown and people were going about their jovial actions, I can pretty much guarantee I would not see one of these kind of after pub fisticuffs. If I went back to the South Wales valleys where I grew up, every Friday night when the pubs closed, it was sport. People were fighting in the streets, and it became, and this is part of deeply embedded structural and cultured forms of violence. And I think, in that sense, I think those everyday forms of violence are not apolitical. They reveal something which is much more endemic to a social order which suffers from a great deal of abandonment and neglect, where young men feel like their only way of finding any form of, masculine pride is to inject themselves with anabolic steroids and go out and beat each other up. And then, so I think there is something of a historical narrative of violence there, which is deeply structured, actually. But in terms of the interpersonal, I do think there's a real important point also, and it comes to how we conceptualize fascism. And to me, one of the better theorizations through the understanding of fascism is precisely the work of Wilhelm Reich, which is picked up by Gilles Deleuze, and this idea of micro-fascism. The fascism of the everyday, the fascism in all our heads, the fascism which will say to the husband that it's okay to dominate the wife and to abuse her. That's fascism. The police officer who thrives on putting his knee on the back of somebody's neck and until they die. That's fascism. That's everyday fascism. That's the willful power over life. And I think that's where we can see how grand ideologies of fascism would never thrive were it not for those micro-fascisms. And I think that's where we can have a more open conversation on terms of the fascism of the everyday and the fascism in all our heads that can teach us to love the domination of power over others.
There's another related question from Tom Ackers. Brad, seems like you're thinking about violence as a specifically intentional act. Ari, your theme of visibility, that the kinds of violence you've been discussing are seen as violence. Andrés mentioned not reducing violence to discrete acts and the global distribution of violence in relation to various forms of oppression. My question is, how would you fit structural violence in here?
Well, I think one of the things about, maybe I didn't make myself clear in that sense. I think obviously we have to deal with intentional violence, but also there is the unintended consequences of violence as well. And part of the issue, first of all, when we're dealing with structural violence, and again, I will kind of default back to the thinking of Gilles Deleuze here, when he says that, how do we come to terms, each and every one of us, with our own shameful compromises with power? Right? How do we kind of, and Deleuze gets this obviously from reading Primo Levi, but there is something about what Deleuze calls the shame of being human. How do we come to terms with the ways in which we all on a daily basis will shamefully compromise with power? Now, do I know, for instance, in terms of just the simple sneakers I'm wearing, what kind of violence goes into that production, right? No, you can't trace it back. And I think that's part of the problem. You can try to investigate it, you can interrogate it further, you can, the types of, commodified societies we live in, first of all, in terms of the materiality of commodification in itself is very difficult to ascertain whether something I've purchased on the other side of the world has some connection to actual physical violence on the other side of the world, which is deeply structured, deeply embedded. We know some trades would be more than others. The cocaine trade would be, evidently deeply structured in violence, but the purchase of sneakers, we don't know in terms of the acts of, violence which go into that. This becomes all the more difficult when we talk about immaterial production. The types of technologies that we deal with today, which are not even material, where we got no idea where to trace the origins of production, to trace the structures. So in that sense, of course, there is an intentionality to violence, which we have to deal with. But how we make sense of the unintentionalities of violence as well is also, the greatest task. And actually, maybe again, I didn't make myself clear. It's exceptional forms of violence are the easiest forms of violence to critique. It's easy to critique 9/11. It's easy to critique, very clear acts of symbolic violence. It's the violence which doesn't even register as violence, which is the most difficult for us to open up a critique on, because it's so normalized, it doesn't even appear to us as violence as such. And I think that's perhaps a bigger challenge for us. And I think it's not a case of, I don't want to become again like Pinker, where it's a case of one or the other. All forms of violence demands critique, but it should be critiqued on its own terms.
I mean, what you say about immaterial labor and immaterial production makes me think of these digital sweatshops that they have, where basically, I think in Indonesia, there might be some where basically very widely used social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram employ people who are paid, very, very little to essentially revise images that have been flagged by algorithms, and there will often be images that show extreme violence, or extreme sexual acts, etc., etc. So there's people who are literally paid to look at these images of violence and censor them so that other people using the platforms, most probably in the West or in other wealthy countries, don't have to look at them.
Mm-hmm. And I think if like again, if I draw back to, for instance, the communities in which I grew up in, which are old mining communities, to be a miner was a very violent life, and it still is a very violent life for lots of people. The physical act of the precariousness of engaging in those, in that act of production, and the extraction that was involved in that, but also the taking away of that old form of production was also deeply violent for those communities in terms of the structural damage that it's wrought. But if you think about the old forms of material production, we used to talk about, the industrial poorhouses, and the industrial poorhouses where you'd have, child labor and slave labor, which basically made industrialization possible. What does the digital poorhouse look like today? Those are serious questions which you point to that requires a far greater, understanding, especially in the absence of knowledge of where the very act and the chains of production even take place. So.
Yeah, I think in terms of structural violence, we also have to think about how that's expressed at the level of subjectivity. So, we think more of structures in which we find structural violence as being objective structures. So, for example, institutions or technologies and things like that. But if you think about the way in which subjects are also formed by inhabiting a certain atmosphere of violence, and how that then enables or normalizes certain other forms of violence, then that's a crucial part of how violence operates. I mean, you can just think about, if you walk past a homeless person on the street, simply being able to walk past that person without experiencing that as a kind of grave injustice which has to be immediately remedied, or something which demands, which makes a kind of ethical demand upon you to intervene. There is a kind of violence at work there, which is already programmed structurally into, the subject, as it were.
Mm-hmm. I think all of us as subjects are constituted in some way or another through violence. So we have that, none of us have been kind of isolated from the lived historical effects of violence. So in that sense, then we're all subjectively shaped in one way or another through violence. And I agree with you, that all these forms of violence do place ethical demands upon us. The challenge, I guess, for all of us, first of all, is to try to work out ourselves which ethical demands resonate with us. And that in itself is a question, why is it that a refugee will make an ethical demand upon me, but a homeless person won't, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. So what is it about the choices that we make in terms of the ethical demands? Because violence should make an ethical demand, but how do we kind of recognize the ethical demands and the choices we all make? And I think part of also maybe the wider problem that we face today is still perhaps a belief that we either cannot do anything about the kinds of violences that we do in the world, that we face in the world, or if we do feel and get kind of, think that there's a response to violence, it immediately falls back into moral purities, and that becomes religion of a different kind. And I think that, again, has been, to me, one of a certain troubling element with certain leftist politics today is it's kind of collapsed back into a certain moral puritanism, which is equally problematic, because we should condemn violence, but also we have to be kind of wary that we don't suddenly become priests by a different name. And I think that is also, maybe I'm being very Nietzschean in my wariness of moral purities, but I think it's right as well that we uphold that.
So we have another question. Your discussion of political violence, which you mentioned always comes with a justification or rationalization, was interesting. Where does violence against women fit into this? Since, as many feminists have argued, the personal is political and violence against women is therefore political. However, violence against women often comes without justification. Its perpetrators often don't feel the need to rationalize or justify it. How does it fit with your general view of political violence?
Mm-hmm. In my work, I'm not interested in starting from a definitional point of view. So I don't want to start and say, this is my definition of political violence. This is what it looks like, because invariably that ends up being kind of exclusionary anyway. What I'm interested in is how violence functions politically. And what, in that sense, I'm very much interested in why, for instance, are men on battlefields political violence? Homelessness or violence against women not political violence, right? So in that sense, because both of them will, if you name someone as political violence, it invariably invokes a certain imperative and it gives a demand to that violence. So in that sense, of course, could we say homelessness is political violence? Well, absolutely. Could we say violence against women, is a form of, 9/11 taking place every single day? Well, absolutely, right? So in that sense, but to me, what I'm more interested in is the way in which the language of politics functions politically to label certain forms of violence as political and other forms of violence as not political. Now, while I get this kind of argument that the personal is political and the political is personal, I'm also think that I have some issues with some of that theorization as well. Because to me, too often actually, that especially when we deal with a theoretical critique, we can collapse theory so much into the personal that any form of theoretical critique becomes an affront to a person. So you can say, well, actually, this is and actually, I think the more closer we get to theory, the further away from the body we become. Because to me, the purpose of theory is not to authenticate the self. It's actually to leave the self behind and become something other than what you were. So in that sense, I don't think engaging in a theoretical critique is necessarily a form of violence against a subjectivity. On the contrary, it's an attempt to work beyond the entrapments of subjectivity in that way. So in that sense, I think the personal can be political at an empirical point of view, but theoretically, I think the task of theory is not to collapse the personal with the political or the personal with the theoretical. On the contrary, it's to disembody that.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, in the case of Mexico, where there's a huge problem with violence against women, I think it's a context which demands that we understand the intersections between different kinds of violence. And precisely as you say, the boundaries between what is deemed political and what is not become quite porous when you start to really engage with the situation in detail. I think what you see in Mexico is, a situation in which you already had a lot of more invisible violence. So, maybe domestic violence against women, intersected historically with a situation in which widespread impunity became the norm. So it became easy to go out on the street and kill someone and nothing would happen to you. And when you have those two things intersecting, you have a situation in which it becomes easy to kill a woman without any consequences whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And so I think often, these categorizations, what's political, what's not, or what a certain kind of violence is, they have to be thought of really in their articulation, don't they?
And I think you raise another important point in terms of, if one of the first conceits and the first myths that we have to deconstruct is this idea that progress saves us from violence, right? And progress, especially technological progress, will save us from violence. Because it doesn't actually, it means that we increase our capacity to annihilate one another exponentially. So too does the myth that law will protect us from violence. I think again, we have to read Kafka to recognize the violence of law. And you talk about impunity. People who have impunity to violence don't operate outside of the law. They are protected by the law. The sovereign order will protect them. So I think we have to recognize then the ways in which law and progressive narratives and technologization all kind of interplay with one another in that kind of way.
So I think I have time for one final question. When we see extreme violence on social media, for example, Myanmar children shot down by the junta, are we, or at least too many of us, desensitized to act? Is the danger that we're left swimming in violent images with no ability to think strategically before being confronted with the next image of the grotesque?
I think it's a really important question, and I don't think I really have an answer to it, only in so much as, I used to kind of believe that we weren't desensitized to violence, that actually if people see something which is abhorrent and intolerable, that they will be affected and they will turn away from it. But I'm increasingly of the opinion that the ways in which social media operates more generally and the way in which it's actually leading to the collapse of the political imagination can only be actually part of a sanitizing process. And I think I'm changing my position on this, but I certainly think that there is something around the ways in which the image itself now has become so ubiquitous. It doesn't, it no longer demands critical reflection. And maybe we can end on, the work of Paul Virilio. And I think Virilio shows remarkable foresight when he says that we're in an age where speed has conquered politics. And I think if violence demands anything, it demands a sustained critical reflection, and that takes time. And it's critical reflections which you are not going to have on the instantaneous platforms of social media. So